And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Leaders from around the world are gathering in Annapolis, Maryland today to take part in a U.S.-sponsored summit on the Middle East. President Bush met separately with Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert and Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas at the White House Monday. More than 40 organizations and countries, including Saudi Arabia and Syria, are attending the conference today. Hamas was not invited. A final agenda has not yet been drawn up, but a draft of a joint document was leaked to the Israeli newspaper Haaretz. It makes no mention of the situation in Gaza or of core issues like the status of Jerusalem, settlements, borders, the separation wall, and Palestinian refugees. Today, we spend the hour on the Israel-Palestine conflict with two of the world's leading thinkers, former South African Archbishop Desmond Tutu and world-renowned linguist and author Noam Chomsky. They recently spoke at a conference in Boston, sponsored by Sabeel, a Palestinian Christian organization. The conference was called the Apartheid Paradigm in Palestine-Israel, highlighting issues of justice and equality. We begin today with Noam Chomsky, professor of linguistics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology for over half a century. Chomsky is the author of dozens of books on U.S. foreign policy. His most recent is called Failed States: The Abuse of Power and the Assault on Democracy. Noam Chomsky spoke before a packed audience at Boston's historic Old South Church.
Personal discomfort, because anything I say will be abstract and dry and restrained. The crimes against Palestinians in the occupied territories and elsewhere, particularly Lebanon, are so shocking that the only emotionally valid reaction is rage and call for extreme actions. But that does not help the victims, and in fact it's likely to harm them. We have to face the reality that our actions have consequences and they have to be adapted to real-world circumstances, difficult as it may be to stay calm in the face of shameful crimes in which we are directly and crucially implicated. Well, I've been asked to talk about the apartheid paradigm and the proper response here, so I'll do that, though not without some additional reservations. We have to recognize that there will be no clear answer as to the question of whether the apartheid paradigm applies in Israel or in Boston, right here, or elsewhere. The genre has, after all, only one example, South Africa, and there are similarities elsewhere in many dimensions, and it's fair enough to bring them up, but there's very little point debating whether they are close enough in one or another case to count as apartheid, because that will never be settled. We know that in advance. I've brought up similarities in the past when I thought that they were appropriate. Actually, the one time I recall clearly was exactly 10 years ago. That was at a conference at Ben Gurion University in Beersheba. It was on the anniversary of the 30th year of the military occupation. And in the talk there, I quoted from a standard history of South Africa on elections in the Bantustans, which I'll read and just change a few words and you'll know what it's about. South African retention of effective power through its officials in the Bantustans, its overwhelming economic influence and security arrangements gave to this initiative of elections elements of a farce. However, unlikely candidates as were the Bantustans for any meaningful independent existence, their expanding bureaucracies provided jobs for new strata of educated Africans tied to the system in a new way, and a basis for accumulation for a small number of Africans with access to loans and political influence. Repression, too, could be indigenized through developing homeland policy and army personnel. On the fringe of the Bantustans, border industry growth centers were planned as a means of freeing capital from some of the restraints imposed on industrial expansion elsewhere, and to take advantage of virtually captive and particularly cheap labor. Within the homelands, economic development was more a matter of advertising brochures than actual practical activity, though some officials in South Africa understood the needs from their own perspective for some kind of revitalization of the homelands to prevent their economies from collapsing even further. Well, I won't waste time expressing the similarities to the occupied territories, but you can do that quite easily. 10 years ago, that was the optimistic prospect for the occupied territories. By now, even that's remote, and reality is far more grim than it was then. There's no time, and I presume no need, to review the harrowing details. We're now approaching George Bush's historic Annapolis Conference, as it's called, on Israel-Palestine, so we can anticipate a flood of deceit and distortions to set the proper framework. And we should be prepared. We should be prepared to counter the propaganda assault, which has already begun. Just to pick a couple of examples, Bostonians could read in the Boston Globe a few days ago that at the Taba conference in January 2001, now quoting, Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak accepted ideas floated by President Bill Clinton that would have produced a Palestinian state in 97% of the West Bank and 100% of Gaza, but these forthcoming gestures failed. The evil Palestinians refused Israel's generous offers, keeping to their time-honored insistence on seizing defeat from the jaws of victory and proving that they're not partners for negotiation. Well, there's one fragment of truth in this conventional fabrication. There was a conference in Taba. And in fact, it did come close to a possible settlement, but the rest is pure invention. In particular, the conference was terminated abruptly by Prime Minister Barak. The truth is completely unacceptable, so the facts are either suppressed, as they generally are, or, as in this case, just inverted. And we can expect a good deal more of it. Actually, the truth about the Taba conference merits attention. That week, in 1 week in January 2001, was the one moment in 30 years when the United States and Israel abandoned the rejectionist stance that they've maintained in virtual isolation until the present. And that may suggest some thoughts about another familiar fairy tale that you could read about a couple of days earlier in the New York Times, where the respected policy analyst and former high government official Leslie Gelb wrote that every U.S. administration since 1967 has privately favored returning almost all of the territory to the Palestinians for the purposes of creating a separate Palestinian state. Note the word privately, crucial. We know what the administrations have said publicly. Publicly, they have rejected adamantly anything remotely of the sort ever since 1976, when the United States vetoed a Security Council resolution calling for a two-state settlement on the international border, incorporating all the relevant wording of UN 242, the basic diplomatic document to which Washington appeals when it's convenient. A U.S. veto, it's worth bearing in mind, is a double veto. One part of the veto is that the actions are barred, of course. And it's also vetoed from history, as in this case. So you'll work really hard to find it, even in the scholarly literature.
We'll come back to Professor Noam Chomsky's address in Boston, and then we'll go on to South African Archbishop Desmond Tutu. They were both speaking at the Sibylle Conference. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. Back in a minute. Jimi Hendrix playing at Woodstock in 1969. He would have been 65 years old today. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As we return to MIT professor and author Noam Chomsky speaking recently in Boston at the Old South Church at a conference called The Apartheid Paradigm in Palestine, Israel.
Sometimes the public rejection of a separate Palestinian state is more articulate and considerably more extreme. So take, say, George Bush #1, who is reputed to be the most hostile to Israel of U.S. presidents. In 1988, as you know, the Palestinian National Council formally accepted a two-state settlement, and the Israeli government responded. This was the coalition government of Shimon Peres and Yitzhak Shamir. They responded by issuing a formal declaration that there can be no additional Palestinian state between Jordan and Palestine. Additional because for Shimon Peres and his labor coalition, Jordan already was a Palestinian state. It's a view that's attributed to the right wing, but that's mistaken. This is Shimon Peres. The United States reacted to that with what was called the Baker Plan. James Baker, Secretary of State. The Bush-Baker Plan endorsed Israel's position without qualification and went on to add that any Palestinian negotiators would have to accept that framework, namely no second Palestinian state in addition to Jordan. That's Bush #1, the alleged critic of Israel, and the respected diplomat James Baker. Again, the truth is inconvenient, so virtually none of this was reported, and you'll have to search hard to extricate it from the web of self-serving propaganda that dominates commentary and reporting, of which Leslie Gelb's article in the New York Times is a typical but not unusual example. Well, I'm not going to go on with that, but the diplomatic record is one of uniform rejectionism, apart from the week in Taba, and unilateral rejectionism, increasingly so. By now, virtually the entire world agrees on the two-state international consensus of the past 30 years, pretty much along the lines that were almost agreed upon at Taba. That includes all the Arab states who actually go beyond to call for full normalization of relations with Israel. It includes Iran, although you won't find that published here, which accepts the Arab League position. It includes Hamas. Its leaders have repeatedly endorsed, called for a two-state settlement, even in articles in the U.S. press. That also includes Hamas's most militant figure, Kamal Mishal, who's in exile in Syria, and it includes the rest of the world. Israel